So welcome everyone. Good to see a good audience in the auditorium. I think it's close to the maximum we've had in the last 12 months, if not 2 years. So great that everyone could come. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we are on today, the Turrbal and Jagera people, and we acknowledge their continuing connection with land, water and community. We pay our respect to them and their elders and their cultures and their elders, both past and present. So thanks for coming, everyone. And it's a real privilege to have Professor Deborah Terry here today with us. She's the Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Queensland. Professor Terry is a highly experienced leader in the Australian university sector and an internationally recognised scholar in psychology. Since August of 2020, Professor Terry has served as Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Queensland, and prior to that was the Vice-Chancellor of Curtin University in Western Australia from 2014 until 2020. Having grown up in Perth and studied in Canberra, Professor Terry completed her PhD in social psychology at ANU in Canberra, and then moved to Brisbane in 1990 to begin her academic career in the School of Psychology. And between 1990 and 2014, Professor Terry progressed through a range of academic positions at UQ before moving to senior university leadership roles. Professor Terry is a fellow and past president of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and an appointed member of the Australian Research Council Advisory Council. And she currently serves on the board of Australia and New Zealand School of Government, AARNET, and the National Schools Resourcing Board. She's a former chair of the board of Universitas Australia and a member of the Universitas 2021 Executive Committee. Professor Terry was made an officer of the General Division of the Order of Australia, AO, in June of 2015 in recognition for her distinguished service to education in the tertiary sector. So it's a real privilege to have you here today, Debbie, and she's going to continue discussing our game changer theme of 2022, and that is looking towards 2032, the challenges and opportunities for the research sector. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Scott, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. Certainly makes me feel quite old listening to how long I've been certainly at the University of Queensland, but great privilege to be obviously in my current role, and thank you very much for the invitation to present today, and really looking forward to hopefully having some time for questions and discussion at the end. But can I also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting here today. We honour their elders and their continuing cultural and spiritual connection to this land as we walk together on the path to reconciliation. Now, what I'm going to do today is to just go through a number of areas. I'm going to talk at a high level about Australia's research performance and pipeline, and I'll talk a little bit about the impact of COVID on our research pipeline. I'm then going to talk about Queensland's performance in medical research funding schemes. I'm going to think about a bit about what the future might look like. I'm going to then talk a tiny bit at the end about UQ now and into the future, and then looking ahead. So Australia's research performance and pipeline, something that is critically important to our future as a nation, an economy and a society. And I think we all know, and you would all appreciate this, that nationally we punch above our weight in research. And many of you here today contribute to that fantastic reputation. We are responsible for around 3% of the world's scientific outputs, while being home to only 0.3% of the world's population. So you'll often hear it talked about that we punch above our weight in terms of discovery science, in terms of research and research outputs. The 2019 Excellence for Research in Australia evaluation indicated that more than 85% of Australia's research was rated at or above world standard. So further confirmation. And if we just take the Nature Index, and that's obviously focusing on a particular group of journals, Australia was 10th in the world by fractional count of outputs, that is share of authorship. And you can see in that table below, particularly in the life sciences, extremely strong, earth and environmental sciences, chemistry and physical sciences, but of course recognising that the nature stable in a sense is not fully comprehensive. But the important point is we are in a good position. We do have very, very good scientific outputs, discovery science, and we are known for that across the world. But when we come to outcomes for innovation, and there's been a lot of focus on this over many years in Australia. We've just had a recent review, which I'm going to refer to in a moment, but this has been something that the Australian government has focused on for many years. Now, if we have a look at the Global Innovation Index, this is just probably regarded now as the most important innovation index that compares countries nationally. We're ranked 25th overall. Okay, so if we think about the Nature Index, ranked 10th overall. And if we look at innovation inputs, okay, so that's the input side of things, our institutions are highly ranked. Our medical research institutes, our universities are highly ranked, 10th globally. Human capital and research, again, ranked very highly, 12th in the world, and a range of different indicators that go into that. So the inputs are really good. And that's inputs into an innovation system. But when we look at outputs, our business sophistication, knowledge and technology, that and technology outputs, so outputs in terms of products that are produced here, industries that are here, scale-ups and new industries that are supported in Australia, that's where we fall down. So when you hear, and you'll hear it very often, Australia is very good at the input side of it, but not so good in terms of the innovation outcomes. It's these kinds of data that are referred to. And in this figure here, the business sophistication and our capacity to start up, scale up quickly and to keep that capability in the value chains in Australia, and the knowledge and technology outputs is where we fall down. Now, the recent government review reached the very same conclusion. This review was published earlier this year, the University Research Commercialisation Action Plan, and I will acknowledge from the outset that I was involved, I was a member of the working party that assisted the previous minister in relation to this report. But it reached very much the same conclusion. It was a review that was undertaken over, Minister Tehan launched the review in 2020, but it took place across all of 2021, a lot of international comparisons, a lot of, I think, trying to understand what else we need to do. And essentially it concluded again that we rank well globally on innovation inputs, such as rankings and research outputs. However, our commercial outputs here in Australia are relatively low, as assessed by business collaboration and new product innovation. And there's a very telling table in that report, and I do encourage anybody who's interested, just go onto the department's website and download it. It is a good report. So academic ranking of world universities, top 200. Australia does well. So we are 7th in the world in terms of how many universities we have in the top 200. That's a good thing. Highly cited publications, top 10% in the world in all disciplines. And you can see Australia's in good company there. And again, punching above our weight if you take into account our relatively small population compared to the United States and the United Kingdom, and indeed Canada as well. When we look at translational, so that's the second group. Now we're moving along that innovation pipeline now from basic discovery research through to translational. So the proportion of higher education R&D funded by the business sector, 2017, we start dropping. 13th in the world, US 16th, UK only 21st, but you can see Canada higher. The proportion of firms, businesses cooperating on innovation activities with higher education or indeed with government in 2019. Again, we drop even further down to 32nd in the world. And then when we get into the commercial outputs, so a lot of this was based on what you would know very much as TRL levels, translational readiness levels across that full pipeline. When you get down to the commercialisation end, percent of patent cooperation, treaty applications with collaboration, again, we're not performing as well as we do in terms of basic research. Percent of firms in Australia that introduced new to market product innovation in 2019, again, relatively low globally. So that's, I guess, a sense of the broad level of the conclusions, but you can also see it when we have a look at how research funding, and this is research funding across the board in Australia, it's not only from government, it's also from universities, it's also from business. You can see in Australia, it tends to be at the basic research end, quite a lot in applied research, but less in that experimental development, that is development for market, assessment of market readiness, scaling up. We are proportionately doing much less than Israel, which is often put up as the poster child in this space, less than Japan, less than South Korea, less than the US, perhaps similar to the UK. Again, part of that report, with then a number of other indicators that come from the World Economic Forum, observing that Australia has relatively, we're risk averse in terms of entrepreneurial risk. So 36 in the world. And again, you can see Israel and the US very high. Growth in innovative companies here in Australia, keeping that value chain here in Australia, the economic value chain, the sovereign capability, the jobs in Australia, relatively low, and very low in relation to university industry collaboration in R&D. Okay, so again, out of the same report. So that, I guess, gives a sense of where we are in terms of research performance for the nation, very clearly. And there's numerous, there have been report after report in Australia that has observed the same thing. We are good at basic discovery research. We understand it, we do it well, we do it at scale. We are globally competitive. We compete at the highest level and we collaborate globally. And that's really good. But the more you get towards the commercial outcomes, the less effective our innovation ecosystem is. But I want to end this part of the talk by just talking about the pipeline. So the research pipeline is obviously critically important. So whenever we're looking at the success of our research system, we have to look at the support coming through for our early career researchers and our mid-career researchers. Now, we were very concerned, and we are still concerned, that the pandemic obviously impacted on that pipeline. This just gives you a sense of our level A's and B's at UQ, March 2019, compared to May 2022. There has been a bit of an increase, and that's because we've put additional support into postdoctoral positions, in particular, through this period. We did that very deliberately because we knew that this was a concern. So nevertheless, although the number of ECRs at UQ has increased during the pandemic, there has been and there is still concern about job prospects and security, and we really understand that. Widespread uncertainty and disruption of research, obviously during the pandemic, and as many of you will know, limited opportunities to travel to conferences, present research findings, and do all of that networking, which is so important to particularly early career and mid-career researchers. And we know it was a particularly difficult time for female early career researchers. There's been a couple of big studies that have been published. There's certainly out of a big Danish study that the gender gap in academic publishing rates widened globally as the output from our female colleagues fell in 2020. A very big Danish study was undertaken. It covered a whole range of areas, looking at around 450,000 authors in 4 disciplines: medicine, biology, chemistry, and clinical medicine. Women's output was 17% below males in 2019, but that gap had grown to 24% in 2020. So we were seeing some impact of, obviously, the impact on all of our lives, but particularly women and primary caregivers, as you would all know. Analysis by Dr. Alan Finkel, when he was Chief Scientist of Australia for the government, found exactly the same trend in Australia, and that study was conducted in 2020. So that's step one, an overview of where we sit in research in Australia. Number two I want to come to is really our performance as a state in medical research funding schemes. And I'm sure many of you have seen some of these data before, but I'm just going to go through an updated set. Now, if you look at the grey bars here, that is percent of GDP is the light grey bar, and percent of Australia's population is the dark grey bar. Okay, and then you look at 2019, and I'm just focused here on NH and MRC funding. 2019 NH and MRC funding, this is to the state as a whole, 2020 and 2021, and Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland and South Australia. Now, it's pretty obvious, Victoria outperforms on share of NH and MRC funding if we are simply to take as share the proportion of the population, or indeed proportion of Australia's GDP. Okay, and that's consistent over years, and it's very marked. 25% of Australia's population, but attracting 45% of NH and MRC funding. If you have a look at New South Wales, it's probably closer to parity, but then if you go down to Queensland, it is consistently, our NH and MRC funding is consistently less than our share of Australia's population and GDP, and you can see they're quite similar. In contrast, if you go to ARC, Australian Research Council, Queensland attracted 20% of ARC funding across 2018 to 2020, which is perfectly in line with our percentage of population and GDP. Okay, so it's not research across the board. We do well, and we do very well in a number of different schemes through the ARC, a number of different schemes that are funded by in agricultural research, for instance, we do well. But NH and MRC, you can see that relative gap. Victoria is also earning the largest share of the Medical Research Future Fund. Now, this is a bit harder, these data, to play with because MRFF is relatively new and you will always get a fair bit of lumpiness to start off with. But this is 2020's disbursements through the MRFF, 2021 and the special COVID-19 scheme. And you can see that Victoria certainly had a very good year in 2020, but remains obviously dominant 2021 and through the COVID-19 special scheme. So, as you know, MRFF funds target health and economic benefits through support for innovative research, translation and commercialisation. So they are more beyond basic research, and our lack of scale is evident, particularly when it comes to medical translation. And we know that Victoria and New South Wales both have 2 Group of 8 universities that are certainly very active in both NH and MRC and MRFF, and multiple medical research institutes. So is it just that we're not so good in terms of the competitiveness of our NH and MRC applications? Well, there's no evidence of that. Really, if you're in this scale is sort of a bit exaggerated. It doesn't go up to a full 100%, but basically the success rates are pretty similar across the country. So it's not that what we are submitting is poorer than in any other states. That is not the issue. Where you do see a problem is in terms of the average number of NH and MRC applications by state, and in this case, over the past 3 years. You can see many more, obviously coming in from Victoria, then New South Wales, then quite a drop down to Queensland, and then South Australia and WA, which are of course smaller states. And when you compare the percent of applications submitted by each state relative to the state's population size, not surprisingly, you can see that it's higher than 1 for Victoria, close to 1 for New South Wales, and a bit below 80.8 for Queensland. And I'm going to come back to that point because this isn't about just putting in more and more applications at all. It really comes to the scale of our capability here in the state. So Victoria and New South Wales submit far more NH and MRC grant applications than Queensland, and in both cases, pretty close to their percent of population. The issue for Queensland is our relative lack of scale in medical research. So if we look at the big 5 of the group of 8, so, certainly in size and in research effort, these are the big 5 of the group of 8: Melbourne, Monash, Sydney, UNSW and Queensland. And they're often referred to as the GO5 just because of scale and size. And you can see Melbourne and Monash, performing well in NH and MRC. You always get a bit of lumpiness by years. Sydney going up over the last 3 years, 19, 20, 21, a bit of lumpiness for UNSW. And you can see for UQ, the Queensland member of that group, 2021, we did have a relatively good year and a much better year. But you can see that compared to Victoria and New South Wales, there's just not as many grants coming through. And this isn't meant to be a criticism of other institutions, but basically, given the size of UQ, our links into medical research institutes, our embeddedness in clinical services in a whole range of areas, we basically 70% of all of Queensland applications to NH and MRC that were successful came from UQ. So 71 versus 31. And if you look at the dollars, it is really UQ and then the other universities in QIMR. So that's not meant to be a criticism, but it really does show why Queensland as a state is not being as successful as Victoria or New South Wales, simply because of the scale. We are heavily reliant on one institution, as you can see here, and those data don't shift by year at all. They're very, very similar. And we also have, then if you dig down and have a look at Queensland's applications again, we tend to be better at the basic science end than the clinical or cohort studies. So this is breaking it down even more to say, all right, in terms of the NH and MRC grants that we're putting in, investigator grants in either basic science or clinical and health service, or the number of clinical trials and cohort studies by state, you can see where the differences are. I mean, we tend to actually do quite well in basic science, given the scale of our capability in the state, and you can see certainly above New South Wales in 2021. But where you see that problem is when you get into the clinical and health services side, and also quite striking in relation to clinical trials and cohort studies. And I think that then feeds into our success in MRFF. So, second part over that gives you a sense, and I've now focused obviously very much in the funding that supports medical research broadly, both NH and MRC and MRFF, and we can see some issues there for Queensland. So what does the future look like? when you break down, you break down funding of research in Australia, there are some striking things that have occurred. What you can see here, and this is Andrew Norton's data, he is linked to ANU, but what you can see here is that research-specific income from both government and non-government, so that's business support of research and government support. Remember, Australia is relatively low on business support of research, but nevertheless, that's counted there. You can see that, yes, it's been gradually going up, but, you know, it's not a small incline. The biggest shift across that period of time has been the research that has been supported by universities, okay? And that has been linked to our international student revenue. So universities will attract more international students to the extent that they are globally competitive. And of course, UQ does attract a very strong cohort of international students that allows the university, not for profit, to invest some of that revenue back into our research. That is what has grown over the last 20 years. And I think those data are quite clear. And you can see it even from 2010, there's been a significant increase in university research expenditure. By contrast, government funding has been relatively flat, and that growth has been funded through increased international fee revenue. It's been a function of the reputation of our institutions, the reputation of our education, the reputation we have for strong international education outputs, that we are an attractive destination. But the recent growth in university expenditure is not assured for the future. It's not something we can guarantee into the future. Obviously, the pandemic had big impacts on international education, and we are still seeing our students returning gradually to Australia. We still have many of our students who are studying online offshore. So it's not necessarily assured into the future. And if you have a look at that increase in higher education research expenditure, so that's by the university sector, you can see here another way that that is reflected from 2000 to 2018, very similar data, and it is highly correlated with increase in academic publications. So you can see a very strong correlation there, you know, whether we read in causation too much into that, but there is a very strong correlation across that period of time. Our system has got bigger, and that system has generated more outputs. And if we go back to the ERA exercises, during that period in time, the quality of those outputs has improved. And it's a really important message, which I'll come back to in a moment. So what are the current and the future projections for research funding? Well, during the pandemic, we were very clear with government the importance of protecting the research pipeline. The research pipeline, our early career researchers coming out of PhDs, our mid-career researchers are absolutely critical to our future. We were very concerned as a sector that that part of the pipeline was going to be differentially impacted by the pandemic for the reasons I've talked about. So we were able to attract an extra $1 billion of funding that was announced during the pandemic in October 2020 for essentially research block grant through what is called the Research Support Program. That was really important. UQ attracted 100 million, close to $199.6 million of that. That shows that we're responsible for about 1/10 of Australia's research effort. And we invested all of that. It didn't go to the bottom line. We invested all of that in research outcomes, research support, and particularly ECR support through the postdoctoral research fellows. If we look into the forward projections, forward estimates in the budget from in May, it shows that discovery funding is absolutely there. Discovery funding will continue. There is ongoing funding for NH and MRC at ARC at current levels, but with some indexation that's been built in. The Medical Research Future Fund, MRFF, in the May budget before the election, a $6.3 billion 10-year investment plan was released, and that will result in increased disbursements to $650 million per annum, up from $455 million in the last financial year. So that's essentially what was announced as part of the most recent budget. And if you look at the MRFF new 10-year plan, $2.1 billion for medical translation, $1.5 billion to attract significant challenges, $1.4 billion for innovative treatments and clinical trials, $1.3 billion for breakthrough discoveries and support for career development in Australia. And just recently, I had the privilege to meet with the head of the Wellcome Trust in the UK. We were there for alumni visits and other visits. Wellcome Trust is going in exactly the same way in how they are looking to reconfigure their programs into the future. They are going in exactly the same way. So what else has happened? Well, in February of this year, $2.2 billion was announced to support the university research commercialisation package. So I talked about the report and the working party that had basically looked into research commercialisation. That report was released, and $2.2 billion, in addition to what I've just talked about, was announced to support that package. And the four major components of it, really three major components, are Australia's Economic Accelerator, $1.6 billion for stage-gated grants. This is beyond TRL 1 to 3. So it's for proof of concept. You think something's coming out of your basic research, you think it's going to have some impact commercially in a translation sense. It'll be proof of concept, proof of scale, and commercialisation. So stage-gated, 3 stages, and to commence in July of this year. So proof of concept, stage 1, proof of scale, stage 2. And just because you get into stage 1 doesn't necessarily mean you'll get supported into stage 2 and stage 3. It will depend on the outcomes. Trailblazer Universities was also announced in February. So that was $243 million for university industry collaboration in areas of national manufacturing priority, where it was clear, again, that those interactions would lead to commercial outcomes in Australia. And I'll come back and talk about that in relation to UQ in a moment. There was also an announcement for industry-focused research fellowships. That is at all levels. These will be administered by the ARC, DECRA, right up to laureate, for those researchers who move in and out of industry. And that would be for highly trained, PhD trained researchers who may be in industry primarily. They will be able to attract ARC fellowships at all levels, from early career right through to laureate. And PhDs, with the view that our PhD students need to be involved more in placements, industry placements during their training, and that will be supported through the research training package, which is part of RBG into the future. There were also some potential changes announced for how research block grants would flow to universities, but that's still open for consultation. So what does that mean? I think the main, if I could just go back here, what is important here is that looking forward, there is both discovery funding, but there is more funding being placed in the translation and commercialisation side of it. I think there is absolute recognition of the importance of discovery science and basic research. As the old adage goes, and I often say it, you know, mediocrity never led to anything. You've got to have excellence in science and excellence in discovery to have the outcomes we want for clinical outcomes, for translation, for commercialisation. Excellence is absolutely critical. So we've got a new government, and I can say there is clear bipartisan support for translation and commercialisation. The new Albanese government has pledged its support for the University Research Commercialisation Action Plan, and that occurred before the election. And since the election, the Honourable Ed Husic, Minister for Science and Industry, has also, and he spoke at Science Meets Parliament a couple of weeks ago, announcing a $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund. And in his words, it's shaped up along the lines of what the CSIRO advises are key areas for the country into the years ahead. It would be across a range of areas from value-added resources and agriculture to supporting medical innovation. And there's details in terms of how that's broken down. He also said, and one of the big signals we wanted to send to you all when Prime Minister Albanese set up a portfolio name, because I know it's created a bit of interest. He was saying when we all gathered together for Science Meets Parliament, Scott was there, why are you calling it industry and science instead of industry and innovation? And his words, we're here to say we're putting science back at the forefront, understanding the importance of science, but bipartisan support for a focus on translation and commercialisation. So what does this mean for the future? As I said, there's an ongoing commitment to maintain current levels of support for basic research. And through the Research Commercialisation Working Party, a submission from the Business Council of Australia, we must not let our basic research, this is from the Business Council of Australia, we must not let our basic research funding be supplanted by a renewed focus on commercialisation, but where additional resources are available for applied research, the more the better. A focus on research translation can drive further discovery, creating a virtuous cycle between applied and basic science. And further, that any commitments for growth in support are largely in the areas of translation and commercialisation, which I talked about, and they are driven by real economic imperatives, both nationally and at the state level. Productivity Commission submission, the creation and adoption of knowledge, ideas, products, processes and ways of doing business, in short, innovation, are critical for maintaining our high standard of living, ensuring our ongoing international competitiveness, creating jobs and delivering future economic prosperity. And so it will drive a pressure to diversify research funding. There's no doubt about it. That's coming. It's bipartisan, and it's been driven by quite frankly some economic challenges into the future. Using the proposed new categories, which would be sort of industry funded versus government, 57% of UQ's 2020 research funding would be categorised as government funding and 43% as industry funding. So there's more we can do there. You know, if we aspire to having balance there, there's more that we can do there. There is the capacity to increase industry, business, not-for-profit funding, as well as philanthropy. And just to show you in the past 5 years, UQ's research, health and medical research, has attracted close to $120 million from philanthropy. We're very active in that space. An extra $12 million for COVID research and our vaccine effort. And the view is from JB Weir that is likely to grow into the future, the capacity for philanthropy to support research in this way. So finally, just to end off with talking a little bit about UQ, it's a nice picture of what we all used to look like. Well, maybe I'm not that old, going to university, things have changed a bit. So I'm not going to talk about the university. I'm going to really give a couple of slides. We continue to perform well. If we take the aggregate ranking of world universities, the main rankings, we're 51st in the world and 2nd in Australia. In terms of QS subject rankings, which just came out, we were ranked, meaning we had enough to rank highly on the world stage in 48 subjects. That's #1 in Australia, jointly with the University of Sydney. So we are a broad and comprehensive university, and we have research strengths right across that breadth. We're consistently ranked, as many of you will know, #1 nationally for commercialisation revenue and value of equity held in startups, active startups. We're very committed to that space. In the Trailblazer University scheme that's just ended, we are leading the Food and Beverage Accelerator with $50 million, and we are a core partner in the resources technology future critical minerals project led out of Curtin University with James Cook as another partner. We make significant investment in central research platforms, national collaborative research infrastructure, NCRIS, and other services. We're number 3 in Australia for PhD load. We're the number 1 destination for Queensland students with ATARs over 90. And we've announced this year new regional medical pathways with both USQ and CQU, missing a U there, Central Queensland University, so that medical students can be fully trained in the regions if that is what they're looking for. By 2032, just very quickly, and I won't go into this in detail, this just gives you a sense of what the universities are looking for. So our highly sought after graduates, high quality postgrad and lifelong learning, leveraging the breadth and depth of our research capabilities and vibrant precincts, which I'll come to in a moment, that we're a trusted and agile partner for entrepreneurship, knowledge exchange and commercialisation. We've got a strong commitment to capacity building in the Asia Pacific. We're very committed to playing our role in Queensland, and that's what's called the Queensland Commitment, really trying to break down barriers to education and supporting students from disadvantaged backgrounds to come and study at UQ, and obviously deeply committed to the public good. So we have invested $50 million in a health research accelerator HERA program. So going back to our relative performance in health, NH and MRC and MRFF funding, we've committed $50 million to this program to recruit outstanding researchers to augment our health medical research and innovation capabilities. And we've just announced the first round coming out of HERA. So that is very deliberate investment by the university to say we are very committed to this area. And as I say, those announcements were made recently. We've also brought in new capability in government relations so that we can work much more nimbly and directly with government, where we're seen to be a partner and helping to find solutions to problems facing government. We've got a new enterprise level research partnerships area led by Paul Nichols, Shannon Willoughby leading the government relations. We've recently reviewed UniQuest, and we've committed to an investment fund that will support UQ startup opportunities, not just staff, but also students and alumni. And we have announced further support for early career and mid-career researchers. So ECR Research Development Program, a knowledge exchange and translation fund, obviously our Athena Swan work, and this year we'll be presenting an industry engagement award as well. Our precincts are vitally important, and obviously we're at one of our very important precincts here at TRI, and we have to work in partnership, and we're very committed to doing that. We will only make an impact when we work closely in partnership, and we're extremely committed to doing that, obviously with Metro South, Metro North, PA, MARTA, as you know, we do engage very actively, and we're very committed to doing more of that into the future. So I'll just leave you with a few questions. I think we all need to understand what we need to do to enhance Queensland's profile in health and medical research. How do we support the next generation of clinician scientists? How do we diversify our research funding sources? And it's something we think about a lot at UQ. How do we build that deep and broad capability to compete across the whole innovation pipeline, moving beyond startups to scale-ups and beyond? What do research and academic roles look like into the future? And I might have actually missed one point there, that our new academic appraisal processes, which Mark Blows has played a lead role in, we recognise translation, impact and commercialisation. Our academics, as they're going up through to confirmation and promotion, don't have to be good at everything. We recognise that we've got to have researchers working across that whole pipeline, and also a focus on collaboration and partnerships. But what do research and academic roles look like into the future? How do we facilitate more porosity between our schools and institutes and industry? and what else can we be doing as a university to support TRI and obviously this precinct. And I'll just leave you with realising the vision for this great precinct and TRI. And if you go back to the Brookings Institute in the US, they talk a lot about innovation districts, and they talk about what's called the Anchor Plus model. And that, in their words, is centred around major anchor institutions and a rich base of related firms, entrepreneurs and spin-off companies involved in the commercialisation of innovation. The model, in their words, is best exemplified by Kendall Square in Cambridge and the explosion of growth around MIT and other nearby institutions like the Mass General Hospital. And for those of you who've been to MIT, you can't tell where MIT ends and begins just because of how many entities and startups and scale-ups want to be around MIT and the hospital. But they also talk about the Cortex district in St. Louis, flanked by Washington University, St. Louis University, and the Barnes Jewish Hospital. So the opportunities are terrific. You are all contributing to that, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much, Scott.
Well, thank you very much for fantastic insights into the university sector and funding. We have about 10 minutes for questions. We'll take some from in the auditorium and some from outside, people watching online. So we have a question here, Paul Clark, over here on my left. Alan, this one.
Or should I just go there? Yes. Okay.
Thank you. Debbie, thank you. I think you have articulated the importance of Translational Research Institute in your talk, and also the wonderful opportunities that we're going to have in the very near future. So I think thank you for that. But you did highlight two areas in which we're weak. One is obviously our clinical research, I think. So if you have any further thoughts about how we could develop that further. And then the other thing is just our scale. And I suppose a slightly provocative question would be, do we need a Monash or a UNSW equivalent in Queensland?
Thanks, Paul. Just to take those two questions, well, I'll go to the second one first and then come back to the first one. I mean, I think how we build the scale is really important. And I think, what this does articulate is, as I said, it's not about the quality of what we're doing in the state. The success rates are good and they're strong. It's really around that scale. And I think it's how we build that with our counterparts at the other universities and really bring together those teams and provide, how we scale up. And it mightn't be scaling up just with one other university, but with multiple universities. And, we're very lucky in Queensland. We have a number of extremely strong universities, but I think we need to be more deliberate to do that, to really understand where we're being outperformed by other states, as I say, simply because of scale. And how do we as Team Queensland address that? I think in terms of remind me of your first.
It was more about the clinical research.
Yeah, the clinical
because
research.
That's a relative weakness.
Yeah. And I think that has really driven, to a large extent, our HERA initiative. And that was very clear that it was to be at the translational clinical interface end. You can see with the successful outcomes, it was across a broad range of areas. And certainly Queensland Health is committed to this. And I think if Jeff McColl was here, he would say that, we all have to work closely to ensure that we've got the clinician scientists coming through and that they are supported. And, there are a number of programs in Queensland Health, but I think, trying to see if there's more that can be done in that area, I would certainly be supportive of, because I think that's what we've got to do, but it will be working together and pointing to the importance of that. That's just one part of it, but I think it is an essential part of it. And how do we have, you know, more cohort studies, more clinical trials actually being undertaken here in Queensland?
One over here and one over here. Alison after 18. All right.
Use the microphone. No, they won't hear you on the screen.
Thank you so much, Prof. Terry. I think that was really, really interesting and incredibly helpful. As chair of the ED&I committee, I am concerned about this widening gap that we're seeing in terms of the outputs of female researchers over the last couple of years, exacerbated by COVID. I wonder, do you have any thoughts about how UQ can think about how we can try and close that gap a little bit and I suppose empower our female researchers in the next few years to come?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and certainly through our Athena Swan program, we are committed to doing that, but we are actually very committed to hearing ideas of what might be helpful. So, you know, in a sense, we've got our broader support for EMCRs, and that's led out of Mark Bloser's office. And that's, you know, it is increasingly becoming an issue that we understand it's early career, but it's also mid-career. And that's probably something that's changed across the time that I've been in academia. But I think with the Athena Swan, and the university allocates funding to our Athena Swan program through that additional research block funding that we attracted, we allocated an additional $1 million. So we are very open to hearing ideas. And I'm the chair of that committee going forward to really understand what would help. Because sometimes some of the things that are put up may not actually be what's required. So I would encourage you through Scott, through Paul, Maha and others to indicate what would be helpful, and we would certainly be open to receiving those ideas. We've still got quite a lot of the funds that we haven't expended yet, and so we will be looking to do so.
Excellent. Thank you.
Down here. Hello. Down the front.
No, I'm fun. I'm looking in the wrong direction. Sorry.
So you're right, Alison Pettit, Mater Research and UQ. I have two questions. And so one is relating to the recent report that's come out of Health Translation Queensland, which aligns with a lot of the data that you showed today. But one point that you didn't accentuate was that one difference between Queensland and other states, particularly Victoria, is the amount of Queensland government investment in research and translation, which they have upped the ante in recent years, but there's still a massive gap there, particularly, you know, notable things like I think Queensland's one of the only governments that isn't investing in a cohort study looking at the Queensland population. So how do we encourage government to up the ante and support us? And then two is our employment model, where most people are on relatively short-term contracts that doesn't really incentivize that longer-term, bigger blue sky approach contributing to this problem in Australia.
Yeah, so two questions. Certainly as the group of Queensland University, so one of the positive things that came out of the pandemic, and we saw it across Australia, is that the universities in any one state are now meeting regularly. So there's the Queensland Vice-Chancellor's Committee, and that was, you know, driven out of the fact that there were specific issues state by state that needed to be dealt with for the higher education sector through the pandemic. We have certainly put together through QVCC a view as to investment going forward in Queensland and where we would want to see that directed. So it is a very active discussion between that group, between the Deputy Vice-Chancellor's research, the Chief Scientists, innovation and science in the Queensland government. And my view is that, you know, we just need to keep having those discussions. I think they have certainly been heard. And then there are a separate set of discussions, obviously, with Queensland Health around specific issues like clinician scientists. The second issue that you refer to in terms of the employment model, that is one thing when I refer to porosity between schools and institutes. Now I'll just put a UQ hat on. We're very keen to see how we can have more porosity in terms of support for our academics, more joint appointments that would give security, joint appointments that may end up being 100% in a TNR role somewhere down the track. You know, if I think back to people I've worked with over the years, you know, I mean, I've got one very close colleague who came to work with me as a postdoc at UQ, then attracted an ARC postdoctoral research fellowship back then, is now one of our leading teaching academics at the University of Queensland. And through her career, she's moved from being research only and supported for quite a number of years that way to TNR, to teaching focused or a teaching academic. And I think as a university, we need to be looking to provide more security, obviously, particularly for our researchers who are in our institutes, but looking at that through some of these joint appointments and increased porosity. And, you know, we're very committed to doing that, but I think it is also recognising how academic careers are going to change in the future, and how, you know, early career and mid-career researchers at TRI, how they may move across their career into slightly different roles.
Lots of questions.
Yeah.
Could I just, before we go to Meher and David, it's very interesting to hear the sort of government, Commonwealth government investment in industry, academic scholarships and fellowships. But it's also striking to see that as a country, we haven't done very well in the past, and it's a bit hard to know what's the chicken and egg here. Is it the way we're educating? Is it a cultural issue? Is it that we don't have much industry? Will these fellowships make the difference, or are there other things that we need to do at a cultural, national level, and or in how we train our next generation of scientists?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of everything. I think many would argue it's the reward models that we've had in place for our academics and our researchers, that to the extent that academics have been, and researchers, so I use that broad term, academics have been involved more in engagement, more in commercialisation, more in industry-led projects that may not necessarily lead to the tier 1 publications all the time. In the past, I think our promotion systems have biased against those people. So that's why we've made quite a significant change at UQ, and we're very committed to that. And number two, I think industry perhaps hasn't been quite as open to it in the past. We've had a different industrial model to some extent, but it is changing. Our economy is changing. And what we are finding is both SMEs and the big end of town are looking for that expertise. And what we need to facilitate it. Many of you will have spent time in Europe and countries like Germany, where researchers will move in and out of industry, and they're respected by both the university sector and industry for what they bring. And I think we are seeing a bit of a change in Australia. Certainly the conversations I have. And then that means we have to ensure that our PhD students are ready for that environment. And that's where these new placements will help. But, this having industry fellows at all levels of ARC, that's a powerful new announcement. Now it'll take a while to build up, but once we have those role models in our institutions, I think they will make a difference. We're certainly also introducing at UQ some new industry professorships as well, to acknowledge the importance of those people.
So 2 more questions, one from Meher and then David.
Thank you, Debbie. That was a great talk. Mahe Gandhi, MRI UQ. So you mentioned in your talk that mediocrity doesn't achieve anything. And you also showed, you showed slides which showed that Israel actually led the way with tech transfer, but interestingly also with entrepreneurship, and that it was least risk averse. So my question to you is, do you think that UQ could and should try and create a culture that is less risk averse?
So it's a very good question, Maher. And certainly out of, and you would have been aware of the big strategy jam that we had last year to really guide our new strategy. That certainly did come up as one of the themes, that, you know, being comfortable in many areas to kind of fail fast. You know, if it's not working, let's get out of it, but let's try it. And we've tried to embed that very much in the plan going forwards. As you would know, I mean, our entrepreneurship activities for students are just phenomenal. You know, there's like 20,000 participants over the last few years. As I say, that new investment fund will also fund startups coming out of our student population. Our staff, I think, us being less risk averse is absolutely essential. And as I say, there'll be some areas where we won't be, but I think we've got to be more open to, let's have a go. Let's see if this works. If it doesn't, understand how we're going to evaluate that. And I think in other cultures, and many of you will know this, it's not something necessarily to be embarrassed about. Give it a go. If it doesn't work, get out quickly, but don't be punished for it. And I think that's the culture we need to build and support, and there's a real commitment to doing it.
One question at the back.
David. Hi, David.
So
I know it's been a problem.
So 40 years on, I was in the UK for 10 years, and UK has exactly the same problems, and we heard all the same solutions, that we have world-class research and no translation. One scheme that was extremely effective in the UK, which I think Australia could look at, is the Industry Partner Awards, where industry actually puts in 10% of the basic research funding. So in my role at University of Edinburgh, we had lots of strategic partnerships where instead of going to industry and saying, we've got this brand new invention, and them saying, well, we've already got one of those, they're actually engaged in the basic research sector. I wonder if there are, more broadly speaking, what is it that we haven't done that all the successful countries have done?
Yep, it's a good question, David. And I think going back to Brian Wilson's day, and I think I overlapped with, I was a postdoc in his last year, but I think back then we didn't understand quality in the way we understand quality of research outputs now. And I think that has been the big shift in Australia, and it's been an important one. I think back then we published a lot, but it wasn't necessarily at the level that was needed. And there was quite a big, a big shift at UQ, and you would be aware of this over that the last 20 years in terms of the quality of our research and really understanding quality, and the ERA exercise at the national level has been important. But you're right, these discussions have been going on for many years. I think we do, and if you have a look at the report, there is a good scan of international models, which is very helpful. I think it is, I agree with you, I think industry being involved in the R&D effort, but also, and I've seen this work elsewhere in the world, sort of innovation centres, which are actually the university opening up to saying, again, we mightn't have the solutions, but let's bring us your problem and let's genuinely have a look at it. It's not about us necessarily selling a research idea and we need $100,000 grant for that. Let's have a look at what the problem is and see if we can't come together to see what some solutions are. And those innovation hubs, I think, are really making a difference. What's industry looking for? Where are their problems? Understanding the capability of universities and bringing them together in a way that's easy to access. And one of the things I often hear in my role is people, will say to me, we know UQ does great things. It's kind of hard to find our way in, and kind of hard to find our way into where those things are happening. And if we can help facilitate that through some of those interfaces, I think that would make a big difference.
Well, thank you very much. We really enjoyed your lecture today, and you've really shown us as we look towards 2032 what UQ and the university sector is going to look towards. And join with me in thanking Professor Terry for giving a great talk today.